On the night of the 21st of October, 1944, a Canadian private named Ernest Alvia Smith stood upright in the middle of a road outside Cesena in northern Italy and fired an anti-tank weapon into a Mark V Panther tank from a range of 30 feet. This is the story of what happened on the Savio River that night, and it is equally the story of how that night has been retold, inflated, simplified, and in a few places quietly gotten wrong across the 80 years since. Start at the finish, because the finish explains the stakes better than any build-up could. On the 9th of August, 2005, the body of that same man lay in state in the foyer of the House of Commons in Ottawa, and the bell in the Peace Tower was rung 91 times, once for every year he had lived. Flags across Canada came down to half-mast. Before Ernest Smith, that particular honor in that particular building had gone to a handful of governors-general, prime ministers, and members of parliament, with one exception in the year 2000, when the remains of the unknown soldier were repatriated and rested in the same place. Ernest Smith held no rank worth mentioning. He finished the Second World War as a private, and by the reckoning of Veterans Affairs Canada he stands as the only Canadian private to receive the Victoria Cross across the entire war. 16 Victoria Crosses went to Canadians in that conflict, and 15 of them landed on officers, non-commissioned officers, or aircrew. The 16th went to a private soldier from New Westminster, British Columbia, who admitted cheerfully in old age that he had never much cared for taking orders. The Victoria Cross ranks as the highest decoration for valor available to a Canadian of that era. Roughly 1,351 have been awarded worldwide since the decoration was created, and Canadians account for approximately 99 of them, though the official tally shifts between 98 and 99 depending on the counting convention and on which recipients get classed as Canadian. Break that Canadian total apart and the shape of the country's military history appears inside it: 73 in the First World War, 16 in the Second, and 10 before 1914, 5 of those in the Boer War. 3 of the 16 Canadian Victoria Crosses of the Second World War were earned in Italy. Captain Paul Triquet of the Royal 22E Regiment took one at Casa Berardi on the 14th of December, 1943. Major John Mahoney of the Westminster Regiment took one at the Melfa River on the 24th of May, 1944. Private Ernest Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada took the third at the Savio River on the night of the 21st and 22nd of October, 1944. Here is a detail that almost never survives the retelling. 2 of those 16 Canadian recipients, Smith and Mahoney, grew up in the same small city, a place called New Westminster with a population that would fit comfortably inside a modern football stadium. Ernest Smith lived another 61 years after the Savio, and when he died in Vancouver on the 3rd of August, 2005, at the age of 91, 13 living holders of the Victoria Cross remained anywhere in the world. He was the last Canadian. What follows is the verified record. Where that record splits, the split gets stated plainly, and where a widely repeated claim cannot be traced back to a primary source, that gets stated too, because the story of Ernest Smith has picked up a layer of folklore thick enough that separating the two has become part of the work. Ernest Alvia Smith entered the world in New Westminster, British Columbia, on the 3rd of May, 1914. A problem arrives immediately, and it deserves a moment, because it demonstrates something about how this story travels. A large number of sources give Ernest Smith's date of birth as the 27th of April, 1914, and that date circulates through reference material, article summaries, and secondary retellings. It is wrong, or at the very least it stands unsupported. Veterans Affairs Canada states directly that Ernest Alvia Smith was born on the 3rd of May, 1914, in New Westminster, British Columbia. The Veterans Affairs Canada page listing Second World War Victoria Cross recipients repeats that date, the Canadian Encyclopedia repeats it, and the Department of National Defence repeats it. By way of analogy, what you are looking at is a data integrity failure, and it behaves the way data integrity failures behave inside any modern records system. One incorrect entry gets copied into a secondary source, that secondary source gets cited by a third, and within a few cycles the error carries more citations than the correct value. Fixing it means going back to the original authority rather than to the loudest repetition. The military history of one soldier and a corrupted database field break down the same way, for the same reason, which is the absence of a single agreed source of truth combined with the human preference for the nearest available answer over the accurate one. The accurate answer is the 3rd of May, 1914. Ernest Smith arrived second in a family of 5 children. His father, John Smith, drove teams of horses and hauled freight for a living, work that carried the job title of teamster in 1914, and his mother went by Flora Jane Smith. That household sent 3 sons into the Second World War. Bert and Jack, Ernest Smith's brothers, both served and both came home, and his sisters appear in the record as Pearl and Norma. Schooling began at Herbert Spencer Elementary in New Westminster and continued at T.J. Trapp Technical School in the same city. Technical school carries meaning here, because it signals a working-class trajectory, one aimed neither at university nor at a profession but at the trades, in a river city built on lumber, canning, and freight. What Ernest Smith genuinely excelled at was sport. Basketball, football, and lacrosse all occupied him, and lacrosse in British Columbia during the 1920s and 1930s functioned less as a niche pursuit than as something close to a civic religion. He sprinted as well, and that is the detail that matters most. Sprinting produced the name. Ernest Alvius Smith turned into Smokey Smith because of how fast he moved on a track, and that explanation is the one that survives in the record, with no competing version carrying any evidentiary weight behind it. The various other uses of the word Smokey floating around that era amount to coincidences rather than sources. A New Westminster boy ran fast enough that people claimed he smoked, and the name clung to him for the remaining 70-odd years of his life, through a war, a Victoria Cross, a marriage, a business, and a state funeral. Look at the sequence of jobs, because the sequence tells you more than any anecdote could. Ernest Smith came of age during the Depression, in a resource town, at precisely the worst moment of the 20th century to be a young man hunting for work in British Columbia. He put in time at a cannery, then at a shake mill cutting cedar shakes, then in an electrical shop, then for a building and contracting firm. No pattern of ambition runs through that list, only a pattern of taking whatever came available. Cannery work on the interwar Fraser River ran seasonal, brutal, and disposable, and shake mills counted among the most dangerous workplaces in the province. A man rotating through 4 unrelated trades before his 25th birthday is a man for whom no single door ever stayed open. That matters for one specific reason. The popular version of Ernest Smith presents a natural warrior, a man built for the thing he eventually did, and the evidence points somewhere less romantic and considerably more interesting. Smokey Smith was a fast, physically capable, chronically underemployed young man with a technical school education and a reputation for refusing to defer to anyone. In March of 1940, the Canadian Army became the first institution of his adult life that actually wanted him. He was 25 years old. Enlistment came on the 5th of March, 1940, when Ernest Smith joined the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada and received service number K52880, a number that would sit at the top of a citation in the London Gazette 4 years and 9 months later. The Seaforths did not get him first. Ernest Smith approached the Air Force before anyone else, and in his own account, delivered decades afterward, the outcome came down to scheduling rather than ambition. Speaking to Maclean's, Smith laid it out without decoration. I first tried the Air Force. They accepted me, but said I had to wait 6 months. I said, in 6 months the goddamn war will be over. I figured the Seaforths were going somewhere so I joined and I was gone in a week. Read that closely, because the entire operating logic of the men sits inside it. Smokey Smith did not sign with the Seaforth Highlanders out of regimental loyalty, family tradition, or Highland romance. He signed because the Seaforths were leaving sooner, which means the decision turned on a delivery date. The Seaforth Highlanders of Canada were then, and remain now, a Vancouver regiment. Through the Second World War the Seaforths formed part of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade alongside the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry and the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, and that brigade in turn sat inside the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. Those 3 names, Seaforths, Patricius, and Loyal Eddies, would spend the following 2 years crossing Sicily and Italy in each other's company, and whatever befell one of them on a given day generally befell all 3. Training took Ernest Smith east. Basic instruction ran with the Royal Canadian Regiment in Toronto and finished at Camp Borden in Ontario, after which Smith sailed out of Halifax, reportedly aboard the Monarch of Bermuda, and landed in England. Then nothing happened for roughly 3 years. This is the stretch of the Canadian Army's war that almost never earned screen time, and it deserves a moment. Between 1940 and 1943, Ernest Smith and the Seaforth Highlanders trained in England, and 3 years is a long time to rehearse. Look at the proportion. Smith's entire operational life in Italy, running from the Sicily landing to the night on the Savio, covered roughly 15 months, which means the preparation phase ran more than twice as long as the fighting phase that made him famous, and vastly longer than the single hour of combat that earned him the Victoria Cross. Any modern engineering or emergency response organization would recognize that shape instantly, and this is offered as an analogy rather than a claim about doctrine. Fire departments, surgical teams, and aviation crews all live inside the same ratio, which pairs an enormous investment in rehearsal against a very small window of actual execution, where the window opens without warning and permits no revision. The Canadian Army sitting in England between 1940 and 1943 was running the largest rehearsal in Canadian history, and none of the men inside it knew when the performance would start. Somewhere within those 3 years, Ernest Smith picked up the reputation that trails him through every account written since. He was, by universal agreement, a difficult soldier. The specific claim in circulation runs like this: Ernest Smith earned promotion to corporal 9 times and got busted back to private 9 times. That figure appears in Department of National Defense material and across widely used reference sources, and it gets repeated everywhere. It deserves a flag. The 9 times figure cannot be traced to a documented service record in any accessible source, which means it functions as regimental lore, the kind of number that hardens into fact through repetition instead of through documentation. The underlying pattern, in which Ernest Smith repeatedly gained and lost rank, holds up well, and Smith himself never disputed it. The precise count of 9 does not hold up. Treat the pattern as fact and the number as folklore. Smith's own explanation, delivered to Maclean's decades later, needed no elaboration. Asked about authority, he answered, "Oh, yeah. I didn't take orders. I didn't believe in them." Pressed on officers, Smokey Smith proved equally direct: "I've met some fine officers, but some weren't worth a shit." That is a private soldier talking in his late 80s with no career left to protect and nobody left to impress, which happens to be the exact condition under which the most useful testimony tends to surface. On the 10th of July, 1943, Ernest Smith went ashore at Pacino, on the southern tip of Sicily, with the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, in what stands as the first successful major Allied amphibious landing of the war. For the men of the Seaforth Highlanders, 3 years of rehearsal ended on a beach. Most retellings compressed the Sicilian campaign into a few weeks of rapid advance and reduced the Canadian share of it to a footnote wedged between North Africa and the mainland. For Ernest Smith it proved neither brief nor incidental, because Smith was wounded twice in Sicily. That bears restating, given what it establishes about the men standing on the Savio Road 15 months afterward. By the night of the 21st of October, 1944, Smokey Smith was not an untested soldier having an extraordinary moment. Private Smith was a twice-wounded veteran who had already worked through the full arc of the Sicilian campaign, including the fighting around Agira on the 28th of July, 1943, and then through the winter and spring campaigns on the Italian mainland. The specific nature of Smith's wounds never made it into the accessible record, and any source supplying that detail with confidence should be treated warily. What the record does hold is the count. Twice wounded, in Sicily, before any of the rest of it happened. Now to the assignment that shapes everything that follows, because Ernest Smith served in the Seaforth Highlanders anti-tank platoon, referred to throughout the regimental accounts as the tank hunting platoon. Grasp what that job actually involved. An infantry battalion pushing forward carries a permanent structural vulnerability, which is that it cannot fight armor. Rifles mean nothing against a tank. Protection against armor normally arrives from attached tanks and towed anti-tank guns, and those arrive on wheels and tracks, which makes them absolutely dependent on roads, bridges, and ground firm enough to carry weight. The tank hunting platoon exists for the moments when that support fails to arrive. It answers a single question, which is what infantry does when the anti-tank guns cannot reach the position and armor is coming anyway. The platoon worked with mines and the PIAT, a shoulder-fired infantry anti-tank weapon whose effective envelope was measured in tens of feet rather than hundreds of yards. That distance constraint contains the entire story of the tank hunting platoon. Using a PIAT against a tank requires letting the tank come to you, and then requires being closer to it than any rational person would ever choose to be. The structure of that job maps onto a principle familiar from modern layered security design, and this is offered strictly as an analogy. Inside a layered defense, the outer layer never carries the expectation of destroying the threat, because the outer layer exists to slow the threat, channel it, and pin it in place long enough for the inner layer to act. Sergeant Thompson's string of mines on the road outside Cecina did not need to kill a tank. It needed to stop a tank from moving freely, so that a man lying in a ditch with a PIAT could get close enough for the weapon to matter. The mines formed the perimeter, and Ernest Smith formed the last layer. By the autumn of 1944, Smokey Smith had been doing that job for more than a year. In December of 1943, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada fought at Ortona, which remains the one Canadian battle of the Italian campaign that everybody has heard of. A small Adriatic port town, narrow streets, German paratroopers, and a style of urban combat the Canadians invented there out of pure necessity, blowing holes through the shared walls of adjoining buildings and advancing house to house through the interiors, rather than exposing themselves in the open streets. The technique picked up a name, mouseholing, and Ortona picked up a reputation. The Seaforth Highlanders absorbed approximately 103 casualties at Ortona, and 41 of those men were killed. Hold that number, because it is about to break something. Command of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division at Ortona rested with Major General Chris Vokes, who had run the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade in Sicily before stepping up to the division. The Seaforths themselves had been commanded through 1942 and 1943 by Bert Hoffmeister, whose career traces one of the more extraordinary trajectories in Canadian military history. Hoffmeister started as a cadet in the Seaforth Highlanders, climbed to command the battalion, then took the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, and from March of 1944 commanded the 5th Canadian Armoured Division. A regimental cadet became a divisional commander inside a single war. By the time of the Savio, Bert Hoffmeister was running a division and held no direct connection to anything that happened on that road, and Chris Vokes had moved on as well. That deserves saying out loud, because retellings occasionally plant famous commanders at scenes they were nowhere near. Now the part that gets left out. On the 23rd of May, 1944, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada attacked the Hitler Line in the Leary Valley, and in that single action the regiment absorbed 210 casualties, 52 of them killed. Set the two figures side by side. Ortona, the famous one, the battle with the name and the technique and the documentary footage, cost roughly 103 casualties with 41 dead. The Hitler Line, across one day in May, cost 210 casualties with 52 dead. The Hitler Line cost the Seaforth Highlanders roughly twice what Ortona cost them. It stands as the regiment's hardest battle of the entire war, and it has almost completely vanished from popular memory of the Canadian campaign in Italy. There is a reason, and the reason has nothing to do with the fighting itself. Ortona offered a memorable name, a distinctive and photogenic tactic, and a compressed geography that made the whole thing legible to newspaper readers. The Hitler Line offered a set-piece assault on prepared defensive positions in a valley, which ranks as the least narratable form of combat there is. Memory does not rank events by severity, it ranks them by storytelling convenience. Ernest Smith served with the Seaforth Highlanders through both, which means he entered the Savio operation 5 months after his regiment's worst day of the war. Understanding what Ernest Smith was standing in the middle of on the night of the 21st of October, 1944, requires the arithmetic of the preceding 2 months, and that arithmetic is not optional. Between August and September of 1944, the Canadians fought the Gothic Line in the operation designated Olive. The line broke on the 21st of September, 1944, and according to the Canadian Encyclopedia, that breakthrough cost 4,511 Canadian casualties with 1,016 of them fatal. Then it kept going. By the time of the Savio River operation, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division alone had absorbed 2,511 battle casualties since Operation Olive began, including 626 killed. And then comes the figure that almost never appears in a documentary about this campaign. Across that same period, more than 400 men of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division were evacuated for battle exhaustion. Sit with that number, because it is doing work the other numbers cannot. Battle exhaustion served as the term in use for what would now be understood inside the framework of combat stress and psychiatric casualty. Over 400 evacuations, out of one division, across roughly 2 months, recorded as a formal category of loss. None of those men had been shot. Their capacity to keep functioning had simply been consumed, and their removal from the line got written down and counted alongside the wounded. Any organization that tracks attrition understands the difference between those two lines on the ledger, and this comes as an analogy rather than an equivalence. Physical casualties present an input problem, which you solve by replacing the person. Exhaustion casualties present a system problem, because the rate of demand has outrun the rate of recovery, and replacing the individual changes nothing about the condition producing the loss. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division in October of 1944 was running both failure modes at once, and the second one was being recorded in the hundreds. Set that against the campaign totals. Approximately 92,757 Canadians served in the Italian campaign, and Canadian casualties there exceeded 26,000, with detailed tallies specifying 26,254 casualties including 5,399 killed, while other accounts put the fatal figure closer to 5,900. Take the conservative version and the result still holds. More than 1 in 4 Canadians who served in Italy became a casualty. Cesena fell on the 20th of October, 1944. 1 day later, on the evening of the 21st, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade received orders to establish a bridgehead across the Savio River. The men receiving that order belonged to a division that had bled 2,511 battle casualties in 2 months, had sent over 400 men out of the line with their nerve spent, and had been continuously in contact since August. Ernest Smith, a twice-wounded private in theater since the Sicily landings of July 1943, sat in the tank hunting platoon. The weather was about to become the most important participant in the battle. The autumn phase of the Canadian campaign in the Romagna carries a name among the historians who work on it, and that name explains the whole tactical problem, because they call it the Battle of the Rivers. Look at the ground the 1st Canadian Infantry Division was crossing in October of 1944. North of the Gothic line the country flattens out toward the Adriatic, and it is cut, over and over again, by watercourses running down from the Apennines to the sea. The Savio, the Pisciatello, the Ronco. Each one lies directly across the axis of advance, each one has to be crossed, and each one presents an identical problem to an identical exhausted formation, which then walks a few kilometers and runs into the next. That describes a fundamentally different kind of campaign from the one most people picture when they think about the Second World War, and the difference is worth naming precisely. None of this was maneuver warfare. Nothing about it resembled a breakthrough followed by exploitation across open country. What it amounted to was a sequence of set-piece assaults against water obstacles, carried out by the same units, in worsening weather, at steadily diminishing strength. The structural pathology of that situation shows up in any modern operational context, and it comes here as an analogy. When an organization faces a series of identical high-cost obstacles instead of one large one, two things happen at the same time. Efficiency climbs, because the procedure gets rehearsed and every repetition sharpens it. Capacity falls, because each repetition consumes people who are not replaced at the rate they are being spent. Those two curves run in opposite directions, they eventually cross, and past the crossing point the organization executes the procedure better than it ever has while becoming less and less able to survive doing it. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division in October of 1944 sat somewhere on the wrong side of that crossing point, and the numbers say so. Since Operation Olive opened in August, 2,511 battle casualties, 626 of them killed, and more than 400 men evacuated for battle exhaustion, inside a formation being told to force yet another river. That is precisely why the tank hunting platoon mattered as much as it did. Inside a river crossing campaign, the anti-tank platoon stops being a specialist afterthought, because it represents the only anti-armor capability that reliably reaches the far bank at the same time as the infantry, on account of being the only one a man can carry. Cesena fell on the 20th of October, 1944, and the Savio ran immediately beyond it. On the evening of the 21st, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade received the order to establish a bridgehead on the far side. And then it began to rain. The Savio River rose 6 feet in 5 hours. That single fact determined everything that followed, and it stands as the most consequential number in the entire account. Torrential rain swept the sector while the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade prepared to cross, and the Savio, already a serious obstacle, swelled 6 feet across the space of 5 hours. The banks ran soft and close to vertical, which meant that bridging the river under those conditions was impossible. The operational consequence was absolute and immediate, because no tanks and no anti-tank guns could cross to support the rifle companies. State that consequence in its bare form. A Canadian infantry brigade was about to put men across a flooded river into enemy-held ground, and every weapon in the brigade capable of reliably destroying a tank was going to stay on the wrong bank. What you are looking at is a single point of failure in the exact sense that phrase carries in modern systems design, and it comes up here as an analogy. The entire anti-armor capability of the assaulting force ran through one dependency, which was a crossing. Remove the crossing and the capability does not degrade gracefully, it disappears completely and instantly. Every other function of the force stays online. The rifles work, the radios work, and the men remain exactly as brave as they were an hour earlier. But one specific capability, the one that matters most against the specific threat about to arrive, has dropped to zero, and no amount of courage anywhere else in the system substitutes for it. The rain did that, not the enemy. Weather stripped the Canadian anti-tank capability off the far bank of the Savio before a single shot was fired. Now consider what waited on the other side. The German force that came down that road, as recorded in the official citation, consisted of a troop of 3 Mark V Panther tanks supported by 2 self-propelled guns and roughly 30 infantry, and Library and Archives Canada identifies the formation opposing the Canadians in that sector as the German 26th Panzer Division. 3 Panthers, 2 self-propelled guns, and 30 infantry, set against Canadian infantry holding no tanks, no anti-tank guns, and a flooded river at their backs. The one asset the Canadians did have across the water was the tank hunting platoon, which meant some mines, some piats, and a small number of men whose entire function addressed this exact situation. The scenario the anti-tank platoon existed to answer, the scenario justifying its place on the battalion establishment, arrived on the night of the 21st of October, 1944, in its purest possible form. Nothing sat behind it as a fallback. On the far bank of the Savio, the tank hunting platoon was not one option among several, it was the entire answer. The crossing went in by companies. D Company and B Company of the Seaforth Highlanders crossed first and consolidated positions on the far bank, and once that footing held, A Company and C Company passed through them and pushed deeper into enemy-held territory. C Company, under Major Stuart Lynch, known to everyone as Stu Lynch, advanced on the right along the road running toward the village of Pieve Sestina and a nearby church, with the tank hunting platoon attached and led by Sergeant K.P. Thompson, recorded elsewhere as Keith Thompson. Everything that follows unfolded along that one road. Sergeant Thompson made 2 decisions on arrival and both proved correct. First, Thompson laid a string of anti-tank mines across the road. Second, Thompson positioned his PIAT teams in the ditches flanking that road. Picture the geometry rather than the drama. A road running through flat farmland outside Cecina, in heavy rain, at night. A line of mines laid across it. Drainage ditches on either side. And inside those ditches, lying flat in the water and the mud, men holding a short-range anti-tank weapon that only becomes useful once the target has closed to within a few dozen feet. The plan, if that word applies, was to render the road unusable and then kill whatever stopped on it. First to arrive was a German staff car, recorded as a Volkswagen, and a PIAT bomb destroyed it at point-blank range. Then a 75mm tracked self-propelled gun came down the road and struck one of Sergeant Thompson's mines. The mine did what mines do, which is that it did not destroy the vehicle so much as stop it, blowing off a track and pinning it in the roadway. A grenade dropped into the turret finished the self-propelled gun off. That sequence deserves attention, because it demonstrates the layered principle completely inside about 90 seconds of real time. The mine immobilized the vehicle. A man on foot closed the distance. A grenade went in through the turret. No anti-tank gun featured at any stage, which means the weapon that killed a 75mm self-propelled gun that night was a hand grenade combined with somebody's willingness to walk up to the thing and use it. Not everything on that road worked the way it was meant to. Private K.W. Ballard fired a PIAT at the self-propelled gun and the bomb flew straight over it. That detail survives in the regimental account and it appears here deliberately, because accounts of this action tend to present the tank hunting platoon as a machine of flawless execution, and it was nothing of the sort. Men missed their targets. The PIAT was a difficult weapon being fired by exhausted soldiers lying in flooded ditches in the dark at moving armor. Ballard missed, the account records that he missed, and the position held anyway. By this point a burning staff car and a dead self-propelled gun blocked the road, while 2 Panther tanks and a second self-propelled gun remained operational and roughly 30 German infantry remained in the fight. And that is where Ernest Smith enters the account by name. Ernest Smith commanded a PIAT group of 2 men, and under fire from the approaching tanks, Private Smith led that group across an open field to reach a firing position covering the road. Read that again, because most retellings skip straight past it on the way to the dramatic part. Ernest Smith moved across open ground, under fire from tanks, specifically in order to get closer to the tanks. The PIAT's range constraint permitted nothing else, since the weapon does not reach out. The man carries it in. Having reached the position, Smith left 1 man on the PIAT and crossed the road with Private James Tennant to collect a second PIAT. Then a German tank came down the road, firing its machine guns along the ditches on either side. That is the tactic. A tank facing infantry anti-tank teams does not hunt for targets, it hoses the ditches, because the ditches are where men carrying short-range weapons have to be. No way exists to occupy a useful position and stay outside that beaten zone at the same time. Machine gun fire swept the ditch and Private James Tennant went down wounded. Ernest Smith was now, functionally, alone at that point on the road, with a wounded man beside him and a Panther tank coming on. At a range of 30 feet, standing fully exposed on the open road, Private Ernest Alvia Smith fired the PIAT, hit the tank, and put the Panther out of action. 30 feet, or roughly 10 meters. That is the length of a domestic living room plus a hallway, and it is closer than a service line sits to the net on a tennis court. Ernest Smith did not fire from cover, at range, at a stationary target. Smith stood on the road, in the open, at a distance where the tank's own machine guns could not conceivably have missed him, and put a bomb into a Panther. Smith's own explanation of the principle, offered in an interview decades afterward, is the least sentimental sentence in this entire story. You go for a tank, you've got to win, 'cause if you don't put it out of commission, the tank will eat ya. No philosophy lives inside that sentence, only a statement about outcomes. Once you are within 30 feet of a Panther holding a PIAT, exactly 2 results remain possible and only one of them involves you continuing to exist. Ernest Smith understood the transaction he had entered and executed his side of it. And then the situation got materially worse, because 10 German infantrymen jumped off the back of the disabled tank and charged Ernest Smith with Schmeissers and grenades. Consider the position from the German side, since it clarifies what happened next. A tank has just been disabled by a weapon fired from 30 feet, which means the man who fired it stands 30 feet away, in the open, holding an empty single-shot weapon. The tank riders carry submachine guns and grenades. The correct German response was to dismount immediately and kill him, and 10 German soldiers attempted exactly that. Ernest Smith did not withdraw. Smith stepped out onto the road and, working his Thompson submachine gun at point-blank range, killed 4 of the attacking Germans and drove the remainder back. For men, at point-blank range, with a Thompson, on an open road, alone, standing over a wounded comrade, having just disabled a tank with the empty weapon lying at his feet. That is the action. Everything else in the Victoria Cross citation amounts to consequence and endurance, and the act itself occupied a span of time best measured in seconds. Smith's own account of what separated him from other soldiers ran blunt to the point of discomfort. Speaking to Maclean's, Smith put it this way: "I always say most soldiers were afraid to shoot. I was never afraid to shoot. I'd kill the bastards. That's what you're paid for." That sentence carries no bravado. Smith was in his late 80s when he said it, with no career left to advance and nobody left to impress, which makes it a technical observation about combat delivered by a man who had noticed something about the people around him that most participants never say out loud. The Germans came again. A second tank opened fire, more German infantry closed on the position, Ernest Smith's PIAT was expended, and Private James Tennant lay wounded and immobile in the ditch beside him. What Ernest Smith did next is arguably the part that actually earned the Victoria Cross, and it is the part that receives the least screen time in every retelling. Smith went into the ditch, scrounged abandoned Thompson submachine gun magazines lying there in the mud, and held his position. That is the whole action. No maneuver, no counterattack, no heroic charge. A man collected ammunition out of the mud and stayed exactly where he was, because moving meant abandoning a wounded comrade to a second wave of German infantry. Ernest Smith remained in that position, protecting Private Tennant, until the enemy withdrew in disorder. Only after the Germans pulled back did Smokey Smith move Tennant at all, helping the wounded man to cover, getting him behind a nearby building where he could receive medical attention, and then returning to his position beside the road. Returning to the position beside the road, where the tanks had been. Ernest Smith described the situation in his own words in a recorded interview for Veterans Affairs Canada, and the account runs characteristically deflationary. Speaking of the men with him, Smith said, "In the end there was just Jimmy and I, and then he got wounded so that left only me. So, I had to stay out there by myself while everybody else was in the church." Jimmy is Private James Tennant. Smith's assessment of why he survived contains no reference to courage whatsoever. "They must have figured there was a whole army there because they could have wiped me out in no time if they'd known I was practically all by myself." That observation rewards a moment of attention, and it maps onto a principle recognizable from modern signal analysis, offered here as an analogy. The Germans on that road were not measuring the size of the Canadian force, they were inferring it from output. A disabled tank, a destroyed self-propelled gun, a wrecked staff car, and sustained automatic fire from a position that would not stop shooting, all combined into the signal profile of a defended, manned, resourced position. The actual content behind that signal amounted to one private soldier working with scavenged magazines. Ernest Smith survived partly because the enemy's estimate of his strength came from his volume of fire rather than from any observation of his numbers. The regimental accounts record what the fight cost the tank hunting platoon, and Ernest Smith's PIAT partner, Kenny Valar, lost an eye. One more piece of testimony survives from that night, and it stands as the single most revealing thing Ernest Smith ever said about his relationship with authority. Smith recalled Major Stu Lynch inside the church asking the question a company commander asks when a position has been enveloped in the dark, "I think we're surrounded, what should we do?" Ernest Smith's answer, delivered from a private soldier to a major, went as follows: "I suggest you all take a window if you're surrounded and keep your head down." That is a man who had been busted from corporal to private more times than anybody bothered to count, handing a company commander tactical advice in the imperative, in the middle of a battle, and being entirely correct. The outcome of the night came to one tank and both self-propelled guns destroyed, with the bridgehead across the Savio holding until Canadian armor and anti-tank guns could finally cross some hours later. That action opened the way to the capture of San Giorgio di Cecina and a further Canadian advance to the Ronco River. According to figures assembled by the historian Terry Kopp, the cost across the operation reached 191 casualties for the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade together with the West Nova Scotia Regiment, with 33 of those men killed. One flag belongs here. No battalion-specific casualty figure for the Seaforth Highlanders at the Savio appears anywhere in the accessible record, which means sources supplying one are supplying a number that does not survive verification. The figures usually quoted, either 103 casualties or 210 casualties, belong to Ortona and the Hitler Line respectively, not to the Savio. Now the contrarian reckoning, because the popular version of this story carries two specific inflations, and both deserve correcting for the same reason, which is that the true account is better. The first inflation is the word alone. The framing that has attached itself to Ernest Smith presents a lone soldier against an armored column, one man, one weapon, a road full of tanks. It makes for a clean and satisfying image, and it runs roughly 60% accurate, which is the most dangerous ratio a historical claim can carry. Here is what the record actually supports. The defense of that road outside Pieve Sestina was a coordinated platoon action. Sergeant K.P. Thompson chose the ground, laid the mine string, and sighted the PIAT teams in the ditches. A PIAT bomb destroyed the German staff car at point-blank range before Ernest Smith's engagement began. A self-propelled gun struck one of Thompson's mines, lost a track, and died to a grenade drop through the turret. Private K.W. Ballard fired at that self-propelled gun and missed. Ernest Smith commanded a PIAT group of 2 men and initially worked alongside Private James Tennant. None of that describes one man alone, and all of it happened before the moment everyone remembers. Ernest Smith never claimed otherwise. Smith spoke of his crew, and specifically of having men he could trust, which is a section-level soldier describing a section-level fight. And the officer who recommended Ernest Smith for the Victoria Cross said something striking about exactly this problem. Major Stuart Lynch, the C Company commander who put Smith's name forward, described the night as a section commander's battle in which each man did his job more than admirably. Lynch noted that some were luckier than others, that some results turned out more spectacular than others, and that choosing to favor one man over the others amounted to a very difficult decision. Read that carefully, because Major Lynch is describing the central problem of gallantry awards, and describing it from inside the moment. Lynch is saying, in effect, that several men performed to the same standard on that road, and that one of them produced a result which happened to be visible, dramatic, and documentable. That man received the Victoria Cross. The word Lynch reached for was luckier. None of that diminishes Ernest Smith, it does the opposite. Lynch places Smith inside a group of men all doing the same job to the same standard on the same night, and acknowledges that the decoration went to the one whose particular seconds produced a Panther tank, 4 dead German infantry, and a wounded comrade successfully protected, rather than to the one whose PIAT bomb happened to fly high. So what remains defensible is this. Ernest Smith performed a decisive individual act inside a coordinated platoon action, and after Private James Tennant went down wounded, Smith was, at that specific point on that specific road, functionally alone, and he stayed alone, by choice, with a wounded man he would not leave. All of that is verified, sits in the citation, and appears in Smith's own testimony. What does not survive scrutiny is the image of a solitary soldier who single-handedly stopped an armored column from beginning to end. Sergeant Thompson's mine stopped part of that column, a grenade stopped another part of it, and Ernest Smith stopped the Panther and then held the ground. The second inflation concerns the vehicle count. The London Gazette citation credits the engagement with 1 tank and both self-propelled guns destroyed, and that is the official tally for the action. Popular retellings inflate it considerably, and figures in circulation attribute to Ernest Smith, or to his squad, a total of 3 Panther tanks, 2 self-propelled guns, a half-track, and a scout car. That larger accounting does not match the citation. Ernest Smith's verified personal tally on the night of the 21st and 22nd of October, 1944, runs as follows: 1 Mark V Panther disabled with a PIAT fired at 30 feet, 4 German infantrymen killed with a Thompson submachine gun at point-blank range, and the successful holding of a position through a second armored and infantry attack while protecting a wounded man. That is enough, and it requires no assistance. While the record is being corrected, return to the 9 demotions. The claim that Ernest Smith made corporal 9 times and got busted back to private 9 times gets repeated in official adjacent material and across every popular account, and it cannot be traced to a documented service record in any accessible source. The pattern of repeated promotion and demotion is real, and Smith never denied it. The number 9 is folklore that has been laundered into fact through repetition. 3 inflations run through the standard telling of this story, then, and they are the solitary hero, the vehicle count, and the demotion tally. All 3 make Ernest Smith slightly larger and considerably less interesting, because all 3 swap a specific, verifiable, strange, human account for a generic one. The official record of what Ernest Smith did appeared in the London Gazette, issue number 36849, dated the 19th of December, 1944, and published on the 20th of December, 1944, in a special edition, with the Government of Canada citing the same issue and date. The citation opens with a service number rather than a name, which tells you something about the institution that produced it. Number K52880, Private Ernest Alvius Smith, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. It then lays out the circumstance, stating that in Italy on the night of the 21st and 22nd of October, 1944, a Canadian infantry brigade received orders to establish a bridgehead across the Savio River. The flooding appears in the citation. It records that the river had risen 6 feet in 5 hours, that the banks ran sheer and soft, and that no tanks or anti-tank guns could be brought across to support the infantry. The composition of the German counterattack appears as well, listed as 3 Mark V Panther tanks, 2 self-propelled guns, and about 30 infantry. Smith's movement across the open field under tank fire appears. So does the crossing of the road with Private Tennant to secure a second PIAT, the machine gun fire that wounded Tennant, the 30-foot shot that disabled the tank, the 10 Germans who dismounted, the 4 killed with the Thompson, the second tank, the scavenged magazines, the withdrawal of the enemy in disorder, and the removal of Tennant to safety followed by Smith's return to his position. And then the citation closes with a sentence doing something more precise than it first appears. The final language records that by the dogged determination, outstanding devotion to duty and superb gallantry of this private soldier, his comrades were so inspired that the bridgehead was held firm against all enemy attacks, pending the arrival of tanks and anti-tank guns some hours later. Notice the argument being made inside that sentence. The citation never claims that Ernest Smith held the bridgehead. It claims that Smith's conduct so inspired his comrades that the bridgehead was held, which means the mechanism being credited is not one man's firepower but one man's effect on the other men present. Notice as well the phrase "this private soldier." The citation flags his rank inside the commendation itself, and that was deliberate. 15 of the 16 Canadian Victoria Crosses of the Second World War went to men holding rank. This one did not, and the document awarding it said so in the text. One further detail in the timing deserves flagging. Ernest Smith was taken away from his regiment on the 12th of December, 1944, moved to Naples, and flown to England on the 18th, while the citation appeared on the 20th. Smith was physically extracted from his unit 8 days before the world learned why. Which brings us to what happened in Naples, because on the 12th of December, 1944, Ernest Smith was removed from the Seaforth Highlanders and taken there under circumstances that generated a story. For decades afterward, that story circulated. It held that the Canadian Army, having learned this particular private soldier was about to be presented to the king, had placed him under guard to keep him out of trouble before the ceremony. Some versions set the confinement in Rome, others in Naples. For most of his life Ernest Smith would neither confirm nor deny it, and he simply let it sit. Then, in 2003, Smokey Smith confirmed it. Speaking to Maclean's, Smith said, "I got locked up in Naples." His explanation of the Army's reasoning turned out to be an explanation of the Army's reasoning rather than a complaint about it, since in Smith's telling the authorities simply wanted Smokey to be in the right spot. His assessment of the accommodation ran equally practical, because they gave him a couple of beers and he was very happy. Consider the institutional position honestly, because it ranks among the more remarkable administrative decisions of the Canadian war effort. The Canadian Army held a private soldier who had just performed an act of gallantry sufficient to earn the highest decoration in the Commonwealth. That same private soldier carried a documented history of losing rank for insubordination, held publicly stated views on the value of orders, and was about to be shipped to Buckingham Palace to stand in front of the king. The Army's risk assessment concluded that the safest route to that ceremony ran through confining him and supplying beer. The approach worked, and Ernest Smith was flown to England on the 18th of December, 1944. The presentation took place at Buckingham Palace in December of 1944, when King George VI presented the Victoria Cross to Private Ernest Alvia Smith personally, in his private apartments. A precise date needs careful handling here. The 20th of December, 1944, belongs to the London Gazette, not to the investiture. Some accounts state the 18th of December for the ceremony itself, and that specific date carries no corroboration from any authoritative source. What stands established is the month and the location, while the exact day remains unsettled, and any retelling supplying it with confidence is supplying more precision than the record contains. Two details about the ceremony survive from Smith's own account. The first holds that, according to what Smith was told, a presentation in the king's private apartments at night marked only the second occasion in history on which a Victoria Cross had been awarded in that setting. The second involves an embargo. Ernest Smith received instructions to conceal the decoration for 3 days, so that Canadian and British newspapers could report the award at the same time. A 25-year-old private from New Westminster spent 72 hours carrying the Victoria Cross in a pocket and telling nobody, for reasons of press coordination. Then there is Smith's account of the protocol briefing, which is the funniest thing in the entire documentary record of his life. Smith described arriving at Buckingham Palace and asking a guard what he was supposed to do, and the guard told him to do exactly as the guard did and to take a bow from the hips. Smith's response, as he recounted it, went, "Oh Christ, you think I'm going to do that? You're crazy." And the resolution followed, "I just saluted and that was it." A private soldier declined the ceremonial bow at Buckingham Palace, saluted the king instead, and collected the Victoria Cross. Much later, somebody asked Ernest Smith what the recipients of the Victoria Cross had in common, and by then Smith knew many of them personally through the Victoria Cross and George Cross Association, where he remained an active member for decades. His answer came as one word, followed by a laugh: crazy. They were all crazy. Ernest Smith returned to Vancouver in early 1945 and walked into something he had no preparation for, because New Westminster gave Smokey Smith a ticker-tape parade. The city that had produced a technical school student who worked a cannery and a shake mill turned out to receive a Victoria Cross recipient, and the reception ran to the scale that phrase implies. Ernest Smith was then deployed, in the most literal sense, as a promotional asset. Following the award, Smith went to work promoting the Canadian War Bonds and Victory Bonds campaigns, because the government held a photogenic private soldier carrying the highest decoration in the Commonwealth alongside a working-class biography that read like a recruiting poster, and it put him to work on exactly that. Here is the consequence of that, and it rarely gets a mention. Because Ernest Smith had been sent home on leave, Smith missed the Seaforth Highlanders campaign in the Netherlands. The regiment he had trained with for 3 years in England, landed with at Pacino, fought with at Agira, and bled with at Ortona and the Hitler Line and the Gothic Line and the Savio, went on to the final campaign of the war in Northwest Europe without him. The Victoria Cross removed Ernest Smith from his regiment. He was extracted from the Seaforths on the 12th of December, 1944, and that extraction turned out to be permanent, which means a decoration awarded for refusing to leave a position resulted, administratively, in his removal from the unit he had held it with. Marriage came in 1947, when Ernest Smith married Esther Weston, a photographer, and the marriage produced 2 children, David and Norma Jean. Smokey Smith left the army after the Second World War, and then went back. Around 1950 and 1951, during the Korean War era, Ernest Smith re-enlisted, this time as a sergeant. Smith was not sent into combat. His status supplied the reason. By 1950, Smokey Smith no longer counted as a soldier who could simply be posted where soldiers were needed, because Smith had become a national symbol and a living Victoria Cross recipient, and the institutional calculation that had once locked him in a room in Naples with a couple of beers now operated on a strategic scale. Sergeant Ernest Smith served instead as a recruiting sergeant in Vancouver. Consider what that posting actually asked of the men. Ernest Smith, who had stood on a road at 30 feet from a Panther tank because no alternative existed, spent the Korean War years behind a desk in Vancouver persuading other young men to enlist. Retirement from the Army followed in 1964. Ernest and Esther Smith then ran a travel agency, a business called Smith Travel operating in the Vancouver and New Westminster area, which meant a Victoria Cross recipient booked holidays for people for a living. Esther Smith died in 1996. In 1995, at the age of 81, Ernest Alvius Smith was appointed a member of the Order of Canada, and across his lifetime his full styling accumulated to Ernest Alvius Smith, BC, CM, OBC, CD, which covers the Victoria Cross, member of the Order of Canada, the Order of British Columbia, and the Canadian Forces Decoration. By 2004, Ernest Alvius Smith stood as the last living Canadian recipient of the Victoria Cross. 99 Victoria Crosses, or 98 depending on the counting convention, had gone to Canadians across roughly a century and a half. 73 in the First World War, 10 before 1914, 5 of those in the Boer War, 16 in the Second World War, and by 2004 that entire line terminated in one man in Vancouver who had run a travel agency and had a canteen named after him at his local Royal Canadian Legion branch. Ernest Smith took the role seriously in his own particular way, which meant showing up and refusing to be sentimental about any of it. Smith remained an active member of the Victoria Cross and George Cross Association for decades, which kept him in regular contact with the other holders of the decoration across the Commonwealth, inside what has to be the smallest and strangest club in the world, and Ernest Smith belonged to it for 60 years. In 2004, at the age of 90, Smokey Smith traveled back to Italy for the 60th anniversary commemorations of the campaign, and Smith also helped unveil a Canadian postage stamp honoring the Victoria Cross. Something specific and irreversible occurs when the last direct participant in a historical event dies, and it deserves naming, as an analogy, in the terms a modern information system would use. While a primary witness lives, a body of history operates as a live system, which means assertions can be tested against a source that can be queried, corrected, contradicted, and pressed for detail. When the last witness dies, that history transitions permanently to an archival system. Nothing new gets added. Every future claim has to be adjudicated against documents that cannot be asked follow-up questions. For Canada's Victoria Cross history, Ernest Smith was the last live node. And Smith proved a genuinely useful one, because he was constitutionally incapable of the reverent register that usually surrounds this subject. Asked whether surrender had ever crossed his mind, Ernest Smith answered immediately and without softening, "No bloody way. Wouldn't even think of it. People who surrender, they're cowards." That is not a comfortable statement. It lands as a hard, categorical judgment from a man who had stood on a road at 30 feet from a panther and made a different choice, and who felt no obligation to extend generosity toward people who had chosen otherwise. It is exactly the sort of thing that vanishes from the record the moment the last participant stops talking, because nobody else holds the standing to say it. Ernest Smith spent 61 years being asked about 90 seconds of his life. He answered the questions, and he declined to make them noble. Ernest Alvius Smith died in Vancouver on the 3rd of August, 2005, at the age of 91, and what Canada did next has no real parallel in the country's treatment of a soldier. On the 9th of August, 2005, the body of Ernest Smith lay in state in the foyer of the House of Commons in Ottawa. The Department of National Defence account of the funeral spells out how unusual that was, noting that the honor of lying in state in the Parliament building had previously gone only to a handful of prominent Canadians, meaning governors-general, prime ministers, or members of Parliament, with the notable exception of the unknown soldier in 2000. Ernest Smith had been a private soldier. He finished his first period of service holding no rank at all, having lost it repeatedly for insubordination, and he lay in state in the same building and in the same manner as heads of state. The bell in the Peace Tower was rung 91 times. 91 strikes, one for every year, and that is not a ceremonial flourish so much as a duration. At the pace a tower bell gets tolled for a funeral, 91 strikes consumes a meaningful stretch of time, and for the whole of it there is nothing to do except count and wait. Flags across Canada came down to half-mast. Ernest Smith then went home. On the 12th of August, 2005, Smokey Smith lay in repose at the Seaforth Armory in Vancouver, from sunrise to sunset, inside the home of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, the regiment Ernest Smith had joined on the 5th of March, 1940, because it was leaving sooner than the Air Force. The funeral followed on the 13th of August, 2005, at St. Andrew's Wesley United Church in Vancouver, and the scale of it belonged to an entirely different order of public figure. 2 kilometers of procession ran down Burrard Street. Hundreds of uniformed personnel took part, thousands of spectators lined the route, and 4 CF-18 fighter aircraft crossed the city in the Missingman formation. Consider the composition of that image, because it contains the whole contradiction of Ernest Smith. For supersonic jet fighters flying a formation designed to mark an absence, above a 2-kilometer column of soldiers, in honor of a man whose decisive contribution to the Second World War consisted of standing in a muddy road in the rain with a shoulder-fired weapon, a scavenged pile of submachine gun magazines, and a wounded friend he would not leave. The gap between the instrument and the act is the point, because nothing in that procession resembled anything Ernest Smith actually did. What Smith did was stay in a ditch. On the 14th of August, 2005, the ashes of Ernest Alvius Smith were scattered at sea off Point Atkinson, near Howe Sound, from the deck of HMCS Ottawa. A Seaforth Highlander of Canada, an infantry private who had crossed a flooded river in Italy because no boat-borne alternative existed, went back into the water courtesy of the Royal Canadian Navy, off the coast of the province where he was born. His death left 13 living holders of the Victoria Cross anywhere in the world. And then there is the question of the medal, which is where this story splits sharply from the pattern of almost every other Canadian Victoria Cross. Canadian Victoria Crosses have a market. They rank among the most valuable military decorations in existence, and across recent decades a number of Canadian Victoria Crosses have come up for public auction. The Victoria Crosses awarded to Currie, Barron, Shankland, and Mahoney were all sold, and all were secured for the country by the Canadian War Museum. Note that last name. John Mahoney, the Westminster Regiment officer who earned his Victoria Cross at the Melfa River on the 24th of May, 1944, came from the same small city of New Westminster as Ernest Smith. 2 Victoria Cross recipients out of one town, and one of those 2 decorations went to public auction. The other never did, and never has. Ernest Smith bequeathed his Victoria Cross and his full medal group to the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada in his will, and the medals are held at the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada Museum and Archives in Vancouver. That decision rewards examination in structural terms, offered as an analogy. Any object carrying a market price sits inside a permanent tension between two forms of value, which are its price and its meaning within a specific context. An auction resolves that tension in one direction, converting the object into currency and dispersing it to whoever bids highest. A bequest to an institution resolves it in the other, permanently pulling the object off the market and fixing it to the context that gave it meaning. Ernest Smith chose the second resolution, taking the highest decoration in the Commonwealth, an object of enormous monetary value, and making it structurally unsellable by handing it to the regiment he had joined in March of 1940 because it was leaving sooner than the Air Force. An earlier account notes that the original medals were kept in a safe deposit box with replicas placed on display, which is standard practice for objects of that value. One caution belongs here for anyone researching this independently. A miniature medal group associated with Ernest Smith turns up in commercial dealer listings, and that is a miniature and replica set of the kind commonly worn on formal dress. It is not the Victoria Cross awarded at Buckingham Palace in December of 1944. Ernest Smith's Victoria Cross has never been sold at public auction. The commemoration of Ernest Smith spreads across the country in a pattern worth mapping, because the pattern itself says something. In 2011, 3 of Ernest Smith's uniforms from his later service were donated by his daughter to 3 separate institutions, namely the Black Watch Museum in Montreal, the Seaforth Highlanders Museum in Vancouver, and the New Westminster Museum and Archives. 3 cities, covering the regiment he served with, the city he was born in, and a third institution on the other side of the country. A park named Ernest Smith Park sits in Canada, in the Ottawa area, dedicated in association with Royal Canadian Legion Branch 638. A street in Saanich, British Columbia, carries the name Smokey Smith Place. In his final years, a canteen at his local Legion branch was named after him, which is, out of all the honors on this list, probably the one he would have rated highest. Veterans Affairs Canada maintains a dedicated profile of Ernest Smith in its People and Stories material and features him in the Faces of Freedom series. Smith is commemorated in the Visitor Education Centre at the Canadian National Vimy Memorial. The Royal Canadian Legion marks him each Remembrance Day, and the Department of National Defence produced an official book on the Canadian Victoria Cross, titled Pro Valori, in which the story of Ernest Smith serves as the centerpiece. Notice what is missing from that list. No national monument to Ernest Smith exists. No ship of the line carries his name. What exists is a park in a suburb, a street in a small municipality, a canteen in a Legion Hall, 3 uniforms in 3 museums, a medal group in a regimental collection, and a chapter in a government publication. The commemoration of the last Canadian Victoria Cross recipient runs local, scattered, and modest, and it consists overwhelmingly of the sorts of places where ordinary people happen to be standing. A street, a park, and a bar in a legion. The 21st of October, 2024, marked the 80th anniversary of the night on the Savio, and the 3rd of August, 2025, marked 20 years since Ernest Smith died. Every account of this night that presents itself as complete is overstating its position. What follows is what remains genuinely unresolved, stated plainly, because the gaps inform as much as the facts do. First comes the identity of the officer commanding the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada on the night of the 21st and 22nd of October, 1944. 2 names attached to the battalion command in 1944, and those names are Lieutenant Colonel S.W. Townsend, known as Sid Townsend, holder of the Distinguished Service Order and the Military Cross, and Lieutenant Colonel H.P. Bell Irving, known as Budge Bell Irving, holder of the Distinguished Service Order. Bell Irving took command of the Seaforth Highlanders in October of 1944, and the Savio crossing occurred in October of 1944, which places the handover and the battle inside the same month. The accessible record does not cleanly establish which of the 2 men held command on that specific night. Sid Thompson most probably still held it during the crossing itself, but that reads as a probability rather than a documented fact. Settling the question requires the regimental war diary held at Library and Archives Canada, or the regimental history compiled by Reginald Roy. Until somebody does that work, any account naming the commanding officer of the Seaforth Highlanders on the Savio with confidence is guessing. Second comes the Seaforth Highlanders' own casualties at the Savio, where no battalion-specific figure exists in the accessible record. The verified number covers a combined total of 191 casualties with 33 fatal, spanning the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade together with the West Nova Scotia Regiment, drawn from work by the historian Terry Kopp, and the Seaforth's individual share of that total remains unestablished. The battalion figures circulating in connection with Ernest Smith, either 103 casualties or 210 casualties, belonged to Ortona in December 1943 and the Hitler Line in May 1944 respectively. Third comes the date of the investiture at Buckingham Palace. December of 1944 is certain, the specific day is not, and the 20th of December belongs to the London Gazette. Fourth comes the date of Ernest Smith's birth. The 3rd of May, 1914, carries the support of Veterans Affairs Canada, the Canadian Encyclopedia, and the Department of National Defence, while the 27th of April, 1914, circulates widely and carries no support at all. Only an attestation paper from Ernest Smith's service file at Library and Archives Canada would definitively close the question, and until somebody pulls that document, the 3rd of May stands as the authoritative answer. Fifth comes the demotion count, and 9 is folklore. Sixth, and this one matters for anyone building on this material, a widely circulated quotation attributed to Ernest Smith on the subject of taking prisoners appears across popular military history sites and cannot be traced to any primary source or reputable secondary source. It is not reproduced here, and it should not be reproduced anywhere until somebody locates its origin. That amounts to 6 substantive uncertainties in the account of a man who died in 2005, whose actions were documented in an official citation published within 2 months of the event, who gave recorded interviews about it into his late 80s, and whose regiment maintains a museum. If the record of Ernest Smith looks like that, consider the condition of the record for the men who received no Victoria Cross, survived to give no interviews, and became the subject of no government publication. Every one of the 5,399 Canadians killed in Italy had a night like this one, and almost none of those nights generated a citation, an interview, or a museum. Strip the Savio action down to its mechanics and something uncomfortable emerges about how the outcome was actually produced. The Canadian bridgehead across the Savio held, and that result permitted the capture of San Giorgio di Cesena and the advance to the Ronco River. Now trace the causal chain backward. The bridgehead held because a German armored counterattack of 3 Mark V Panther tanks, 2 self-propelled guns, and roughly 30 infantry was stopped. That counterattack was stopped by a small number of men carrying mines, piats, hand grenades, and submachine guns, positioned in drainage ditches beside a road, in the rain, at night. Those men constituted the only anti-armor capability present because torrential rain had lifted the river 6 feet in 5 hours, softened the banks past the point where bridging was possible, and stranded every tank and anti-tank gun in the brigade on the near side of the water. And the single most decisive act inside that engagement came from a private soldier who had been repeatedly demoted for insubordination, who had joined the regiment on a scheduling technicality, and who had spent 3 of the preceding 5 years training in England for a moment that lasted roughly as long as it takes to read this paragraph. Here is the reframe, offered as an analogy rather than as a claim about military doctrine. Complex systems rarely fail or succeed at the level where they were designed, because they fail and succeed at the interface, at the last point of contact, where the accumulated planning of everything upstream either converts into a result or gets lost. Every modern discipline that studies catastrophe understands this, including aviation, surgery, power distribution, and shipping. Enormous structural investment runs upstream, and then a small number of people at the very end of the chain, working with degraded information and no time, determine whether all of it holds. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade's crossing of the Savio was planned at brigade level, and the forces involved came out of a national mobilization, trained 3 years in England, moved across an ocean, and fought up the length of Italy from Pachino at a cost of over 26,000 Canadian casualties. And on the night of the 21st of October, 1944, the whole of it resolved down to whether one twice wounded private soldier, lying in a flooded ditch with a wounded man beside him and a Panther tank coming down the road, would move backward or would not. Ernest Alvia Smith did not move backward. That is what the Victoria Cross was for, and it was not the tank. The citation states the matter explicitly, crediting Smith's determination, devotion to duty and gallantry with so inspiring his comrades that the bridgehead held. The disabled Panther was the visible result. The decisive act was the refusal to leave the ditch. Return to the statistic from the opening, because it carries more weight now than it possibly could have at the start. 16 Victoria Crosses were awarded to Canadians in the Second World War, and Ernest Alvia Smith received the only one that went to a private soldier. That is no coincidence of temperament or luck, and the reason deserves precision, without drifting anywhere near a political argument, since none is intended and none is required. Gallantry decorations get recommended upward through a chain of command, which means a soldier's act has to be observed, recorded, described, and advocated for by officers, who then submit it into a system that evaluates written accounts. The structural bias inside that process does not favor officers because officers are braver. It favors positions where actions run more visible, more legible in a written report, and more likely to be witnessed by somebody holding both the authority and the paperwork habits to push a recommendation forward. A private soldier lying in a drainage ditch in the dark, in the rain, at a point on a road his own company commander could not see from inside a church, sits at the far end of that visibility gradient. Ernest Smith's Victoria Cross exists because Major Stuart Lynch submitted the recommendation, and because the result of Smith's action was unambiguously physical, meaning a disabled Panther tank sitting in a road, for dead German infantry, a bridgehead intact, and a wounded man alive. The evidence lay there in the morning where anyone could count it. Major Lynch's own comment on the recommendation confirms exactly that reading, since Lynch described the night as a section commander's battle in which every man performed more than admirably, noted that some results simply turned out more spectacular than others, and called the decision to favor one man over the others very difficult. The other 2 Canadian Victoria Crosses of the Italian campaign went to officers, specifically Captain Paul Triquet of the Royal 22E Regiment at Casa Berardi on the 14th of December, 1943, and Major John Mahoney of the Westminster Regiment at the Melfa River on the 24th of May, 1944. 3 Canadian Victoria Crosses in Italy, then, comprising a captain, a major, and Private Ernest Alvia Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, service number K52880, who did not believe in orders. Run the same logic across the whole campaign. Approximately 92,757 Canadians served in Italy, something over 26,000 became casualties, and in excess of 5,300 were killed. 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded. 3 out of 92,757. That ratio does not measure how many Canadians in Italy performed acts of extraordinary courage. It measures how many such acts were seen by the right person, survived long enough to be described, and were written up in prose persuasive enough to clear an approvals process. Ernest Smith's own assessment of what separated the holders of the Victoria Cross from everyone else remains the most honest thing anybody has said on the subject, because when asked what they had in common, Smith laughed and said they were all crazy. Smith counted himself among them. Ernest Alvia Smith entered the world in New Westminster, British Columbia, on the 3rd of May, 1914, born to a teamster named John Smith and his wife Flora Jane Smith, second of 5 children in a family that would send 3 sons into the Second World War and get all 3 of them back. Schooling ran through Herbert Spencer Elementary and T.J. Trapp Technical School. Smith played lacrosse and basketball and football, and ran fast enough that people started calling him Smokey. Work took him through a cannery, a shake mill, an electrical shop, and a building and contracting firm, because the Depression had settled over a resource town and those were the jobs there were. On the 5th of March, 1940, at 25 years old, Ernest Smith enlisted in the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, because the Air Force wanted him to wait 6 months and the Seaforths were leaving in a week. Training ran through Toronto and Camp Borden. Embarkation ran through Halifax, and roughly 3 years in England followed. Somewhere inside that stretch Smith made corporal and lost it again, repeatedly, for reasons he never bothered to dispute. Private Smith landed at Pacino, Sicily, on the 10th of July, 1943, fought at Agira on the 28th of July, 1943, and was wounded twice on that island. Ortona came in December 1943, where the Seaforth Highlanders took approximately 103 casualties with 41 killed. The Hitler Line came on the 23rd of May, 1944, where the same regiment took 210 casualties with 52 killed, the worst day in its war. The Gothic Line came in August and September of 1944, an operation costing the Canadians 4,511 casualties with 1,016 killed. By October of 1944, Smith's division had absorbed 2,511 battle casualties since Operation Olive opened, including 626 killed, and had evacuated over 400 men for battle exhaustion. Cecina fell on the 20th of October, 1944. On the night of the 21st, rain lifted the Savio River 6 feet in 5 hours and stranded every Canadian tank and anti-tank gun on the wrong bank. Sergeant K.P. Thompson laid mines across a road outside Pieve Sestina and put PIAT teams in the ditches. A staff car was destroyed at point-blank range. A 75mm self-propelled gun struck a mine, lost a track, and died to a grenade drop through its turret. Private K.W. Ballard fired and missed. Private Ernest Elvia Smith led a PIAT group across open ground under tank fire, crossed the road with Private James Tennant to collect a second PIAT, watched Tennant go down to machine gun fire sweeping the ditch, and then stood up on an open road and put a bomb into a Mark V Panther from 30 feet. 10 Germans came off the back of that tank, and Ernest Smith killed 4 of them with a Thompson at point-blank range and drove the rest off. Then Smith scavenged magazines out of the mud and held the position through a second attack rather than leave a wounded man, and once the Germans finally withdrew in disorder, Smith carried Tennant to cover, got him to medical attention behind a building, and walked back to the road. Kenny Valar lost an eye. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade and the West Nova Scotia Regiment lost 191 men, 33 of them killed. The bridgehead held. The London Gazette published the citation on the 20th of December, 1944, in issue 36849. King George VI pinned the Victoria Cross on Ernest Smith personally, in his private apartments at Buckingham Palace, and Smith declined to bow from the hips and saluted instead. 61 years afterward, the Peace Tower bell rang 91 times, 4 CF-18s crossed Burrard Street in the missing men formation, and the ashes of the last Canadian holder of the Victoria Cross went into the water off Point Atkinson from the deck of HMCS Ottawa. The medal sits in Vancouver, inside the museum of the regiment he joined because it was leaving sooner. Run the proportion one final time, because it is the strangest fact in the life of Ernest Elvia Smith and it never appears in any account of him. The action on the road outside Pieve Sestina that produced the Victoria Cross occupied a span of time measured in minutes, and the moment defining it, the 30-foot shot and the 4 men killed with a Thompson, occupied seconds. Ernest Smith then lived another 61 years. 61 years of running a travel agency called Smith Travel. 61 years married to Esther Weston, a photographer, from 1947 until her death in 1996. 61 years raising David and Norma Jean, working as a recruiting sergeant and then living as a retiree, appointed a member of the Order of Canada in 1995 at the age of 81, returning to Italy in 2004 at the age of 90, unveiling a postage stamp, and drinking in a Legion canteen that carried his name. And across every one of those 61 years, Ernest Smith was asked about the same few minutes, over and over, by every interviewer, at every ceremony, in every anniversary year. What is remarkable is how he answered. Smokey Smith never once elevated it. Handed 6 decades and an unlimited supply of willing audiences, Ernest Smith declined to build a heroic narrative around himself. Asked why he did it, Smith explained the mechanics of the weapon, saying you go for a tank and you have got to win, because if you do not put it out of commission the tank will eat you. Asked why he survived, Smith credited the enemy's faulty estimate of his numbers rather than his own conduct. Asked what Victoria Cross recipients had in common, Smith said they were crazy and laughed. Asked about officers, Ernest Smith answered that some were fine and some were not worth much, which is not the answer of a man performing gratitude for the institution that decorated him. That consistency across 61 years functions as evidence in itself. A fabricated or inflated self-account tends to grow over time, because each retelling smooths and improves it. Ernest Smith's account did the opposite, since Smith spent 6 decades making the story smaller, plainer, and more mechanical, and never once budged from the version he gave at the start. The man was, by every indication, telling the truth, and mildly irritated to be asked. One image in this story refuses to resolve into anything comfortable, and it is not the tank, or the 30 feet, or the 4 men on the road, or the king in his private apartments, or the 91 strikes of the Peace Tower bell, or the 4 fighter aircraft over Burrard Street in the missing man formation. The image is a man in a ditch, in the rain, in the dark, picking submachine gun magazines out of the mud because he has run out of ammunition and a wounded friend beside him cannot move. Everything else in the account of Ernest Alvia Smith runs spectacular, which makes all of it easy to narrate. That part is neither spectacular nor easy, because no audience existed for it. His company commander sat inside a church several hundred feet away and could not see it. Private James Tennant lay wounded, and no possibility existed of it being recorded except by the men doing it, with no reason at the time to believe anybody would ever know. The Victoria Cross citation, written by people who had to decide what the decoration was actually for, put the weight there. Not on the disabled Panther, but on the determination, the devotion to duty, and the effect one private soldier's refusal to move had on the men around him. Ernest Smith was a technical school student from New Westminster who worked a cannery and a shake mill because nothing else came available, who joined the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada on a scheduling technicality, who was busted from corporal to private more times than anyone can now verify, who did not believe in orders, and who declined to bow to a king. None of that predicted the ditch. And that is the part worth sitting with. Every account of extraordinary courage gets written backward, running from the outcome to the person, assembling a biography that appears to lead inevitably toward the moment. The biography of Ernest Smith refuses to cooperate with that method, because nothing in the cannery, the shake mill, the demotions, or the 3 years of training in England points toward a man standing upright on a road at 30 feet from a Panther tank. Which leaves an open question, and it is the one this story has been circling since the first sentence. If the courage that produced the only Victoria Cross awarded to a Canadian private across the entire Second World War could not have been predicted from anything in that man's life beforehand, then there is no reason to assume it was rare. The implication runs the other way. Among the men in those ditches on the Savio, in those streets in Ortona, on that ground at the Hitler line, among the 92,757 Canadians who served in Italy and the more than 26,000 who became casualties, an unknown number were carrying exactly the same thing, unrecorded, unwitnessed, and unawarded. Major Stuart Lynch, who had to choose one name to put forward that night, gave the answer already. Lynch called it a section commander's battle, said every man did his job more than admirably, and observed that some were simply luckier than others. Ernest Alvia Smith was the one whose luck was witnessed.